Welcome to Flat, Cool, and Acid-Free, an OK State Archives podcast, bringing you stories about Oklahoma State University and Oklahoma. I'm Nina Thornton, multimedia producer for the OSU Libraries. On this episode, Olivia Turner, Archives Digital Storytelling Intern, and David Peters, head of the OSU Archives, take a look back at the impact the Spanish flu of 1918 had on the OAMC campus and reflect on the similarities and differences to the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'm so excited to be with you as well. So, as you may know, history is bound to repeat itself. And like many of you know, David and I are wearing masks and sitting 6 feet apart to follow Oklahoma State's guidelines for fighting the spread of COVID-19. But what many of you may not know is that this isn't OSU's first rodeo. About 100 years ago, Oklahoma State was also tackling the Spanish flu. David, could you talk to us a little bit more about the Spanish flu and its impact across Oklahoma and the United States?
So the Spanish flu started about February of 1918. It lasted really actively through about April of 1920. It came in four waves. And so the first wave in that spring of 1918 wasn't that big a deal. But the fall wave, the second wave that happened September, October, November of 1918 was fairly severe. And in Oklahoma, estimated about 100,000 people were infected, about 7,500 people died. And so it did have quite an impact on the state and nation. For Oklahoma State University, once again, our highest time period where we had our most infection was also in that fall of 1918.
So how did the Spanish flu differ from regular influenza symptoms?
The first wave, not really that much. People would get fever, headache. Occasionally people would develop pneumonia as a secondary infection. But it was that second wave, and they're still trying to figure out, I think, if it was just a more virulent strain of the same flu. But that second wave, more and more people began developing pneumonia. They began getting these skin reactions. What it was the human body's immune system overreacting to the infection, and oftentimes that would cause problems. And so the second wave was really the worst, both in the impact it had on the human body, and then of course the numbers that I'd mentioned earlier. But usually pneumonia would be the actual final thing. A bacterial pneumonia would develop, and that was what people would pass away of.
That actually gave me goosebumps. I did not know that. That is so interesting. So what did campus look like during the epidemic?
So let's go back just a little bit. Right before the epidemic, the semester had started in September of 1918. We had about 1,700 students at the time. We had begun a Student Army Training Corps program in which young men who were in the military, but they began training both their military exercises in college campuses, but then also take classes. And so we had a number of young men who were in this training program and taking a lot of engineering classes on campus. And so the campus right before was a little more, I don't know if militaristic isn't the term, but young men in uniforms oftentimes, and they were doing a lot of drill and practice. The campus is fairly small at the time. We only have 2 residence halls on campus. And so, of the students, I think we had a capacity of almost only about 200 students who could live on campus before that fall. With those Student Army Training Corps young men, they took the boys' dormitory, which had a capacity of 120. It had 60 rooms, 2 persons per room. They doubled that to 4 persons per room and increased the capacity to 240. So the boys' dormitory increased its capacity for on-campus housing. And then they converted an old livestock pavilion, which was just a big arena with a dirt floor, but they converted it for housing for another 250 young men to stay there. And so you have a high concentration of young people coming in September from all over, and you have these. Now they're concentrated in smaller areas, and so it's much more densely packed for student housing. And then you still have your large number of students who live in the Stillwater community in that area. So that's kind of setting the scenario for for what's going to happen then early in that fall semester. But it was the beginning of semesters like most. Students actively involved with activities and social activities and clubs and classes and just getting the semester started. So that's what campus was like.
It was, yeah. So it was basically how campus was like last year before COVID, which also kind of started hitting around February.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay. So how well did students and faculty follow the guidelines that was given by Oklahoma A&M during the Spanish flu?
So one of the challenges was the guidelines change, just like we've seen sometimes here. So initially, like when students first arrived in September, they would often go, there would be large groups of students, especially from the ag school, now the College of Agriculture, Division of Agriculture, would go down to the state fair. And so in the Oklahoma City papers, it was saying, oh, the flu isn't that big a deal, just relax, it's okay to come to the fair. So we sent a lot of students and staff and faculty down to the state fair. Within a few weeks, Oklahoma City doctors were saying, well, maybe this isn't as good as we thought. In fact, they had 19 deaths in Oklahoma City in 1 week. And then after that, that was about the middle of October, they shut things down. And that's when they started closing things up. And so initially, as information was coming out, people reacted in different ways. I mean, some people were encouraged to wear masks, and they did. Other people didn't think they needed to. Fresh air was considered a help, and so we didn't have air conditioning at the time in our residence halls, and so all the windows and doors were left open to get air flowing through there. People were encouraged not to shake hands, to wash their hands, and most people followed that. By mid-October, the public schools were closed, the churches were not having services, and so they were kind of shutting. Movie theaters weren't showing movies anymore. They didn't restrict going out to eat, but at that time, very few people went out to eat. They did encourage people to meet in groups of less than 12, and so most of the clubs and social groups shut down. They didn't have any activities. We had a football game the first week of October. We didn't have any more games until November, so they cut out football. So overall, with some variation, students and staff and townspeople started following the procedures once the numbers started going up. And so initially there was kind of reluctance, oh, it's not that big a deal. And then when the numbers started rising dramatically, then people started paying attention. The university never closed, but attendance in class went way down. The football team still practiced all through October, even though sometimes less than half of the team members were out there because others were sick. It just varied greatly. The military still drilled, but they had sometimes less than 30% of the people who actually had been out there drilling. So anyway, they adjusted.
Did the yearbook document the pandemic, or did they try to portray the year as normal?
So the challenge with the yearbook, the 1919 yearbook is the one that would have documented that, because it followed the year, was focused on World War I. And so there's mentions of the flu epidemic, but usually it's in relationship to World War I and servicemen. So there's nothing really dramatic in the yearbook about it.
How did campus life change after the epidemic? So did they just go back to normal? Did they have any other kind of lingering safety precautions?
So eventually it went back to normal. I'm not sure if this would be a good point to really talk about some of the changes that occurred on campus while it was going on, in that as more and more people became sick, initially they didn't isolate them. But as those numbers grew, they began to isolate them on campus. And so there was a small home that was originally intended to be the president's home that had been moved over near the boys' dormitory. And initially, I think about 10 to 12 of the young men were moved into there. But as the numbers swelled on campus, eventually the whole boys' dormitory became an infirmary for the men. And at the same time, where the women's dormitory, it's the Bartlett Center for the Studio Arts now, where the women lived, eventually all of its floors, and where they had residence rooms, became an infirmary for the women. And so both, well, the School of Home Economics, their director, Ruth Michaels, I think it was Ruth Michaels, she calls all classes off in home economics, and all these young women then, and the instructors in home economics, begin caring for not only the women, but also the men. And then what they also do is they give up their rooms, if they have rooms there, so that family members who are coming from outside of Stillwater have a place to stay. Now, of course, this creates additional problems because now you have people who are coming from outside of Stillwater staying in this residence hall, which is also housing people with the flu. And so some of the things they did kind of helped spread it, not only within Stillwater, but then within the Oklahoma. So it was those kind of difficult things that were going on. But as the numbers decreased, things kind of went back to normal. I mean, clubs started meeting again. The football team was playing again. They did make one change for the November game. It was against UCO. There was no yelling was allowed. They eliminated cheering for that game. It was thought that if you cheered, you would threaten your throat, and that would be a problem for you. And so no cheers were allowed. And normally there was a pep rally before the game, and they didn't allow the pep rally before the game. But eventually, as the numbers again declined, they would have pep rallies, and attendance at classes improved. And within 6 months, things had kind of gone back to normal. There would still be articles in the college paper. It was called The Orange and Black, was the title of the paper at the time, about various little flu incidences. You know, an individual might have gotten sick, or someone's family member might have gotten sick. But we really kind of went back to normal.
One of the materials that was used to make the masks during the Spanish flu was cheesecloth. Why did they not use handkerchiefs instead?
So they were encouraging people to sneeze into their handkerchiefs or cough into their handkerchiefs. So rather than like into your elbow like we do now, they were saying to sneeze into a handkerchief. And so they probably considered the handkerchief as your backup. If you didn't have a mask, you'd have your hanky.
Okay.
So that's probably why they didn't use the handkerchief. Well, and of course, men. I'm not sure if every man carried a handkerchief or not, but anyway, people were encouraged to sneeze into their handkerchiefs.
Interesting. I'll tell you, my grandfather always had a handkerchief on him. Up until the end, always had a handkerchief on him.
Well, I think that's true. I think men in years gone by used to carry handkerchiefs with them just for cases like that. So.
Probably, that does make sense. Did the 1918 pandemic impact enrollment at the time?
No, it didn't. Our enrollment numbers were going up. Like I said, we had roughly 1,700 beginning that fall. Within a few years, we were up to 1,900. There was increased enrollment in part because of the Student Army Training Corps, the young men who were there for military training. So, no, it didn't impact enrollment at all.
That's awesome. That's good to know. What happened to students if they got sick? So you mentioned they went to the infirmary for a little bit.
Right.
Was it a situation where, if they got better, did they have to then in turn help other sick students?
So that was very common. So initially, they would go, initially there was an infirmary room also in the women's building, and there was an infirmary room in the boys' dormitory, and then that house. So initially that's where they went. But the numbers exploded so rapidly that those facilities quickly were limited. And so what would happen is people who had been sick and recovered then would help care for the people who were becoming sick. And there were some people early on who weren't sick who were helping people who were sick, and then would carry the infection back to others. There was one young woman who was on the staff. She taught at the secondary school, which was kind of a pre-college course that students could take. Her name was Aura Black. And very, very early in the beginning, in September, she volunteered to help care, kind of serve as a nurse to help care for the sick. And by early October, she had gotten the flu, and she was the first person on campus, at least first staff person on campus to die of the flu. And so she passed away by mid-October. We had a young student, John Connor, I think was his name, or Connell, who also was helping friends who had the flu. He contracted the disease, and then he passed also in October. So we did have a couple of deaths associated with that. But usually it was students helping care of other students, women, mostly women exclusively, I would say women from what was home economics, really acting as nurses, delivering food to people who were sick, delivering medicines, all the supplies and stuff. That was mostly women took over those roles.
You know, you mentioned the name Ora Black, and that actually reminded me of something. Just for a little bit of context about how fast the Spanish flu worked, just 2 weeks earlier, before she had contracted it, or before she started helping with the students, she had taken girls out on a hiking trail. So she was really healthy, and then unfortunately, a couple weeks later, she didn't survive. So that was a fast-working flu.
And she was only probably in her late 20s, early 30s, so she was young, and we may be able to talk about some of the differences or similarities too about those things later.
Do we know if there was any resistance to safety guidelines like we see today?
There were groups who wanted to continue meeting and so refused to obey those limitations of the numbers of people. And this not so much on campus, but in Oklahoma and other places. There were anti-mask societies, groups who would refuse to wear masks. And so there was, human nature hasn't changed that much. There were people who resisted initially, and then as the numbers grew, the resistance declined, but there are other people who maintained their resistance all the way through. They thought it was a farce, that it was fake. So there was the human response always varies greatly, but there was reaction to it. Most people, though, did try to follow guidelines. Of course, one of the challenges like we have today is the guidelines seem to kind of change. They didn't know much about the flu at first, and so as they learn more, they make adjustments. And as we learn more about coronavirus, we're trying to make adjustments. But it's a fluid situation, and then things are always changing.
Absolutely. How many students, faculty, or staff did pass away?
So I can only document one student and one staff member on campus. There were several students who may have been on campus at the beginning and then left because of their illness and passed away. I don't know. I don't have names for those individuals. We did have 6 former students who were now serving in the military who died of the flu during their service. So there were others in the community and on campus who passed, but those are the only 2 that we can identify right now.
But does the Spanish flu mean that it actually originated in Spain?
No, it did not. I'm pretty sure it did not. They think that it actually started in Kansas, and that what happened is you had all these military trainings going on, both at colleges and universities, but also the military had set up various camps for training, prepping people for potential service in World War I as a part of the American Expeditionary Force. And so there's a cook at one of these military facilities in Kansas who's the first documented case. There were probably earlier cases. He had to get it from somewhere. But what happened is with this movement of soldiers, in fact, we had some of our training personnel for the Student Army Training Corps who had been in Kansas before and then came down here to train soldiers here. But you have this movement of military, both within the country, within the United States, but also overseas, as we're moving people to France to fight. It just spread very quickly, but they think it actually may have started in Kansas. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is, I mentioned it started in spring of 1918. Well, so you've got the Germans and the French and the English are mostly involved. The Americans are really just starting to get involved. But they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to do anything that's going to hurt morale. And so it's affecting all of their troops, but none of them are talking about it. Spain, which was a neutral country, and it was impacting the populations in Spain, and their king, Alfonso, I think the 13th, came down with the flu. And so Spain, it's in the papers. They're talking about it. And so the first kind of public notice that people get is it's from Spain. That's where and so they assume it started in Spain. But actually, it probably started in Kansas.
Our next door neighbor.
Hard to believe.
That is crazy to think about. So you had mentioned a little bit before about how the yearbook had really focused on World War I. Mm-hmm. So we know that, the Spanish flu wasn't really the only thing that was occupying the country's mind. We were also dealing with World War I. How did the Spanish flu affect the First World War, if at all?
Fairly dramatically. In fact, for the U.S. at least, more U.S. soldiers died of the flu than died in battle. And so there are large numbers of individuals who passed because of the pandemic and either never made it overseas. A number of people died both in the States while they were in training, and even those who went overseas died. And so for all Germans, French, British, and Americans, all those forces had similar rates. Some of them were a little bit different, but similar rates. But like in the U.S., the military, if they were in the Navy, they had a higher rate of the flu than the Army. Well, they think that was because the Navy were operating these ships carrying people back and forth. So it had an impact on the war, fairly dramatic impact on the war.
So crazy. I didn't know that it had killed more people than combat did.
For the American forces. I'm not sure if that's true for the Germans, French, and British, but I know for the American forces, more died of the flu than died in combat.
That's something I never learned, so that is really interesting to hear about. So with COVID-19, symptoms are worse in some than others. So for example, those who are most affected by the symptoms of COVID happen to be older in age. Was it like that at all with the Spanish flu?
So it was a little bit different. So like you said with COVID, I think over 80% of the cases where people have passed in Oklahoma are over 65. Well, with the influenza, the Spanish flu, a large number under 5 passed away, and then a large number between the age of 20 and 40 passed away, and then a large group over 65 passed away, but it was more evenly distributed between those 3 groups than we have, of course, now. They think part of it was the human body's immune system overreacting, and so children actually have fairly good immune systems, and it just overreacted. Same with young people, 20 to 40, and so the demographics were a little bit different, and so it was a little scarier for everybody because they either were or knew someone in those age groups.
It's really interesting, like I said before, to relate a similar experience from the past to what you're going through today with COVID and the Spanish flu. If you want to learn more about the Spanish flu's impact on Oklahoma State, read David's article, Spanish Flu Hit an Unprepared Oklahoma A&M Campus in 1918 at Oklahoma State's official magazine, State. And if you want to learn more about the Oklahoma State's archives, visit archives.library.okstate.edu. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to DM us on Facebook at Oklahoma State University Archives.
This episode was part of the Archives Live, a monthly video broadcast. Watch the broadcast and stay in touch with the archives by liking and following the Oklahoma State University Archives Facebook page. Find a link to the page in the show notes. This episode featured Olivia Turner and David Peters and was produced by Nina Thornton. Theme music is It's a Process, composed by Ben Stone and Finley Green and published by BBC Production Music, PRS. From the folks at Oklahoma State University Libraries and the Archives, thanks for listening. And always remember to keep your archival material flat, cool, and acid-free.